This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good afternoon. My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is Kaurna land. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and to acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here today on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia, as we hear from the Honourable Kevin Rudd AC as he discusses his latest book, The Avoidable War. The Honourable Kevin Rudd served as Australia's 26th Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010, and then as its Foreign Minister from 2010 to 2012, before returning as Prime Minister in 2013. He is the Global President and CEO of Asia Society in New York and has been President of the Asia Society Policy Institute since January 2015. Following his presentation, Kevin will be joined by the Honourable Mike Rann. For almost a decade, Mike was Premier of South Australia and served as Labor leader for a record 17 years. In 2012, Mike was appointed Australian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, and in 2014, Ambassador to Italy, Albania, Libya and San Marino. Mike is currently the chair of the London headquartered climate group, which operates in 50 countries. And I just want to personally, a very warm welcome to you both. It's wonderful to have you here. So please, a warm welcome to the Honourable Kevin Rudd. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be back here in Adelaide. I'm sorry for my husky voice. I've been ostensibly on the book tour. Actually, I've been campaigning. And when you campaign, as Mike Rann will remember, you often shout a lot. So my voice has yielded. In Perth this morning, they said I sounded like Mae West. And though someone in Melbourne earlier said I certainly didn't look like Mae West. So it's great to be here with Mike Rann, old friend, colleague, and a great Premier of South Australia. As I drove in from the airport earlier today, and I look at some of the infrastructure Mike, you and I invested in this great city. Hospital infrastructure, transport infrastructure, water infrastructure. Dare we mention its name, a desalination plant, which will ultimately be the guarantor of this state's and city's long-term water security. There are many things that we've done together, so I acknowledge his premiership. And it's wonderful to be here at the Bob Hawke Centre. Hawke was an extraordinary Australian Labor Prime Minister. Mike knew him well, I knew him well. I had campaigned with him on so many occasions. And he is unique in the history of the Australian Labor Party and unique in the history of Australian politics. And we honour his memory, his legacy, and his unique appeal to the Australian spirit. That was our Hawke. I'm going to speak to you today for about 15 minutes or so about the book that I've written. And then Mike and I will engage in a conversation. The reason I've written this book entitled The Avoidable War is because since I came second in the 2013 election, some of you might say I lost. I prefer to say I came second. I've been in the United States. Friends at Harvard University invited me there to spend a year working on this question of the future of US-China relations. Then Xi Jinping had just been elected and Obama was into his second term. And following that, I went to the Asia Society in New York, where I've lived, worked, and had my being ever since. I'm now its global president and CEO. And we're a think, do tank of about 250 staff in 15 centres around the world, focusing in part on US-China relations. And during my time at Harvard, a colleague of mine, Graham Allison, wrote this book entitled Destined for War. For those of you who have studied your Thucydides, and of a Saturday afternoon in Adelaide with no games to attend, would obviously be reading your Peloponnesian Wars on a regular basis. At least that's what we do in Brizzy on a Saturday afternoon. But the Peloponnesian Wars, Thucydides' trap is described as the eternal contest between established powers and rising powers. In the case of the Peloponnesian Wars, between established Athens and rising Sparta. And it was, to paraphrase Thucydides, it was Athens' rise and it was Sparta's rise and Athens' fear of Sparta's rise which gave rise to that war. And what Graham Allison did in his book, released in 2015, was look at 16 historical case studies of established powers and rising powers across primarily Western history, not Eastern history, and said that in 12 of those 16 case studies, the contest between established powers and rising powers ended in war. In 4 cases, it did not. The book has been a runaway bestseller in the United States. And while the original text and the original preferred title for the book was Destined for War, ? The American publishing industry removed the question mark. And as a consequence, you have this whole view emerging in the United States body politic that this, in fact, is where we're going. Enter Kevin from Queensland. I'm still here to help. So my response is the avoidable war. Graham Allison and I remain friends and colleagues. In fact, I launched this book at Harvard University with Graham only just recently in the United States before coming back here to Terra, Australia. And the reason for writing the book is that I'm old-fashioned enough to have 2 views about life. One is I actually prefer peace to war. I know that's an old-fashioned view. And I worry about generations of people in the United States and in Australia and elsewhere who don't remember what the horror of war is. And I'm just old enough to remember what Vietnam was like. And my father was a serviceman in the Second World War. And I have a view that not only do I prefer peace to war, but I'm also of the view that there is nothing inevitable about anything, that we have something called human agency. That is, the political leadership of the time shapes events. They can make decisions for good or for ill and take us in one direction or another. Look at the tragic events of 1914. The political class in Europe took a bunch of wrong decisions which landed us in a catastrophic war in Europe, resulting in 60 million dead, including 60,000 Australian servicemen. And the world was changed as a result. And so human agency matters. The decisions of the political class in the event of a crisis or in the prevention of a crisis actually matters. Hence the argument around the avoidable war. The reason we have this contest now between China and the United States can probably be explained for 3 reasons. Number 1 is a change in the balance of power. If you look carefully at the balance of power between China and the United States as it's evolved over the last 30 or 40 years since Deng Xiaoping changed the face of modern China in the period after Mao and the Cultural Revolution. Since that time, China has risen economically, China has risen technologically, China has risen militarily. That's just a fact. And as a consequence of that fact, by the time we reached the 4th decade of this period of reform and opening, In East Asia and the West Pacific, you began to see that China, in fact, had become, to use the American term, a real-world peer competitor of the United States in all categories of the military. Similarly, in the economy, China is now the world's largest trading power, the world's largest exporting power, the world's largest importing power, the second largest source of foreign direct investment around the world, and after the United States, the second largest source of global capital. And when you look at technology, depending on the category of technology, from the information technology sciences through to the life sciences and all categories in between, including artificial intelligence, it's a variable game between where China is, where the United States is. So my overall argument to you is the balance of power has changed. As a consequence, you are thrust, if you like, in the vortex of the Thucydidean dynamic, which is a rising power and an established power, where the balance of power between them is much more equal. For my sins, I read what the Chinese internal discourse says about this. And what the Chinese internal ideological discourse within the Communist Party says about this is that as a result of this changing balance of power, China can now exercise greater influence in the region and the world. And that is what Xi Jinping is doing. Which brings me to the second cause of change, which is the personal leadership of Xi Jinping. He's now been General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party for 9 years. In fact, at the 20th Party Congress to be held this November, he's up for reappointment for a record third term, which those of us who follow Chinese politics closely, as I've been doing since I was an acneous adolescent at the Australian National University back in the Mesolithic period. Or as we in China watching terms says, I've been looking at it since the 12th Congress to the 20th Congress. That's shorthand for 40 years. Is that Xi Jinping is different. He has a different leadership style. Deng Xiaoping's great axiom, followed by his successors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, is as follows: hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. Those 12 Chinese characters, which is Tao Guang Yang Hui Zhuebo Dang Tou, are entrenched in the psychology of Chinese leaders over that 30-year period. And as a consequence, as China's power amassed, it still adopted a passive posture in the region and the world. But Xi Jinping, as of 2013 and 2014, directly and consciously and publicly within the Chinese internal discourse, changed direction and said that that doctrine was dead, belonged to the past. And the new doctrine was that China would now go out and pursue a more assertive foreign and security policy in the region and the world, in order to maximize the presence of China's interests and values in the region and the world, and more broadly in the international system. So his style is not a passive style. His leadership style is an activist style, and some would interpret that as an aggressive style. And often in this country, we seem to think this is uniquely characteristic to China's relationship with the Commonwealth of Australia. Well, it's not. If we were sitting in Korea today, it's the same discussion. If we're sitting in Japan today, it's the same discussion. If we're sitting in the Philippines, it's an identical discussion. If you're sitting in Vietnam, exactly the same discussion. In fact, if you're sitting in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Northern Europe, Western Europe and parts of Southern Europe, and in the developing world, it's much the same discussion. Because this enormous power, China, turbocharged by a population of 1.4 billion, is exercising a gravitational pull, Xi Jinping's term, not mine, towards the rest of the world. Primarily through its economy, primarily through trade, partly through foreign direct investment, but increasingly by other means as well. And so Xi Jinping is different. And the third reason is this: Uncle Sam, the United States, has reacted and responded. You saw the tentative signs of this in the second Obama administration when, you may recall, something called the pivot to Asia. That was in response to China's military build-up in the region, and in response to what China then initiated as a series of island reclamation exercises in the South China Sea. But during the Trump administration, you also saw it unfold when, in the end of 2017, the then National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, redrafted the national security strategy of the United States, and for the first time in its history defined China as a strategic competitor and defined China's principal strategic adversary in the world, in effect, as the People's Republic of China. And that, by and large, is the framework which has been sustained under the Biden administration, which has replaced it. Again, going back to the Thucydidean dynamic, when the balance of power changes, the rising power becomes more assertive, and the established power reacts against that assertion. So when you ask the question, why are we where we are, these are the global factors that are at work here. And our slice of this reality, here in the Commonwealth of Australia and in the Free Colony of South Australia. I'm from the criminal colony of Queensland, is that we are part of this much larger global jigsaw. So the question arises, therefore, if that is the case, and if these two countries are now locked in strategic competition, should that competition be unmanaged strategic competition, or is there a different approach? The problem with unmanaged strategic competition, which is where we are today, on the last day of April 2022, for the leadership both in Beijing and Washington, now staring at each other through their own respective lenses, is that there are no guardrails. There are no rules of the road. It's a bit like Dodge City 1860. Just dodge the shrapnel. Because on any given day out in the Taiwan Straits, or on the seas of the South China Sea or the East China Sea around Senkaku Diaoyuan, and in a different way over the Korean Peninsula, but certainly in cyber and space, there are 100 potential incidents in the offering. Potential collisions between aircraft, potential collisions at sea, and a range of other crisis-inducing events, not even as dramatic as the assassination of an Austrian archduke in June of 1914. And any of these has the capacity to excite crisis, escalation, conflict, and war. The analogy I use, because I spend so much time in Washington, DC, and until recently, at least until COVID, a lot of time also in Beijing, talking to Chinese counterparts, is that the state of the relationship now between the US and China is a bit like exposed wiring, cabling on a concrete floor in your garage with a lot of water on the floor, okay, and no rubber shoes in sight, okay. In other words, anything could happen. It's a live and fissile environment. Which brings me to my final point. The alternative approach, through the prism of strategic realism, rather than me believing, or anyone else believing, that if only these two, the Chinese and the United States, would sit calmly in the corner and have a kumbaya moment with each other, all would be well in the morning, because it won't be. But within the realist framework of accepting the reality that they are in competition against each other, can we have de minima rules of the road, de minima guardrails, which reduce significantly the risks of accidental crisis, escalation, conflict, and war, as well as attending to other challenges in the planet today? And that is the burden of the book. The book speaks about what I call managed strategic competition, or MSC. I've now given it an acronym. And managed strategic competition just has four component parts, maybe. The first is, if you define the strategic red lines between the two countries, around the Taiwan question, the East China Sea question, the South China Sea question, the Korean Peninsula set of questions, and cyber and space, including cyber attacks on each other's civilian economic infrastructure. It is possible for each side to identify through private and high-level diplomacy with each other what the baseline strategic red lines for each side are. At present, that is discovered by push and shove. China pushes one way, the United States pushes back another, and through that untidy mechanism, some sort of equilibrium is established, we hope. But as I said, the risks associated with that are becoming ever more apparent and ever more destabilising. So defining through high-level diplomacy, in the tradition of Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, the basic strategic red lines of each side, and where there will be no bilateral agreement as to the legitimacy of those red lines, knowledge of them and the fact that if you cross them will invite response of an order of magnitude should be on balance stabilising rather than destabilising. The second element of MSC is this. If you can attend to the first set of strategic red lines, then for the rest of the relationship, you can have non-lethal, no-holds-barred strategic competition in the rest of foreign policy, in trade policy, in investment policy, in capital markets policy, in currency markets policy, in technological competition, and in the battle for ideas. The Chinese worldview, the Chinese ideology of Marxism-Leninism, or applied to the 21st century, various forms of authoritarian capitalism, and whether that is a resounding set of values for the rest of the world, or whether it is still either liberal democratic capitalism or social democratic capitalism, as a set of ideas to underpin the future international rules-based system. And as I say in the book, may the best system win. But it's non-lethal. And the third and final category is carve out also, through this joint strategic framework of managed strategic competition, enough political and diplomatic space through which to prosecute our planetary interests, our global interests, which we still hold in common. Combined action on climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because the bottom line is, these are the world's two largest emitters, and Mike Rann, given his extraordinary involvement with global climate change action on the part of corporations and subnational governments, knows this better than most. But also, the next pandemic, it's my melancholy duty to inform you that what we've just had won't be the last one. And we thoroughly botched global cooperation on the first one. We should have been able to snuff this thing out within a month if we had our collective global smarts together. But we didn't. It turned automatically into a geopolitical contest. And then thirdly, global financial stability. I was Prime Minister during the global financial crisis. We came within a hair's breadth of so many of our financial institutions in this country collapsing. We had to intervene. You may remember me standing up one day and guaranteeing each and every one of your bank deposits with the sovereign guarantee of the Commonwealth of Australia and the interbank lending of all of our financial institutions in order to keep the arteries of finance alive. That's when my hair turned white. It's kind of interesting of a Sunday afternoon going out and giving everyone a $3 trillion guarantee. It's not what they taught me in Nambour High School. But the bottom line is this. Now, the amount of debt on global debt markets, because of not just what the Australian government has been borrowing, but what all the other governments have been borrowing to sustain economies during the period of the pandemic-induced recession, means that we have a massive challenge of maintaining global financial stability, particularly in an environment of rising inflation globally, and what will inevitably ensue, which is rising interest rates. And as a consequence of that, even further macroeconomic policy challenges. Maintaining global macroeconomic stability and global macro financial stability, given the debt burden we've got, is not just going to happen naturally, and it won't happen easily in an environment of geopolitical tension and crisis. but it can be managed professionally through the Financial Stability Board, which we established under the G20, of which Australia is now a member. Our government secured that. And through the other instrumentalities of global financial government. And finally, to make A, B, and C work above, you need 2 or 3 of the most senior officials of both countries. In the case of the US, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and their Chinese equivalents, to be the policemen of this joint framework. To conclude, this doesn't solve the problem. It just reduces the risk of us having our heads blown off on the way through. And people often say to me, but Kevin, aren't you just kicking the can down the road? To which my response is, unapologetically, yes. I'm all for kicking this can down the road. If the alternative to kicking a can down the road is having a God Almighty war now, let me tell you which side of the can kicking I am on. This is not appeasement. This is managing in a realist framework a mechanism to reduce the prospects of conflict in this decade of living dangerously, which is the 2020s. And who knows, by the time we reach the 2030s, assuming we do, there will be a different framework which could then perhaps be applied, and perhaps on the part of different political leaderships, to deal with the challenges which remain extant at that time. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to the conversation with Mike.
Terrific to have you back in town, Kevin, and I promise on behalf of the audience not to ask you questions about the programmatic specificity of Thucydidean dynamics, but there are many other questions that we have, including many from the audience who've sent them in, which I've incorporated into my questions, but also will read some to you as well. I wanted to start out by saying that, one, I've read the book, and I have to say that the part, it's a terrific book, and it's been getting rave reviews in the United States and elsewhere. But the bit where you go through the chapter, about 10 different scenarios of where we might end up, and we're talking about 10 different scenarios essentially of war, and who will come out of those scenarios best, although ultimately none of us will. I thought this was a particularly compelling chapter that I hope everyone will read because it is chilling as well as informative. I guess my first question, and this also draws from the audience, is the tragedy of what is currently happening in the Ukraine, which has pretty much reunited the West, energised the relationships of the EU, which was getting pretty complacent, and also an under-resourced NATO, plus a rethinking of European energy policy. Given Beijing's Taiwan ambitions, how would Beijing right now be reading what's happening in Ukraine, where perhaps an invasion is a lot easier than actually a successful suppression of a people?
It's a great question, Mike. The Chinese ultimate strategic judgment about Russia and Ukraine is China wants to be on Russia's side. They share this massive common border, and for most of the history, it's been a bad history. Yeah. From the Tsarist period, interrupted by the communist period, when the history was much better, although for most of that period China itself was in civil war or subject to external invasion. And there was one rosy period, 49-59, of Sino-Soviet cooperation. Then the Sino-Soviets split over ideology and politics after Stalin and under Khrushchev. And then they got it back together again once they resolved the border between Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping in '89. And the last 30 years, it's been step-by-step incremental normalisation. But under Xi Jinping, the normalisation process has gone like that. as he and Vladimir Putin have kind of hit it off. They describe each other as their besties, best friends forever. This is the language they use publicly. It's very unusual for Chinese political leaders to use that language about anybody. So, number one strategic interest is China does not want to return to a period which it had during the Sino-Soviet split of having more than 2/3 of its military capabilities pointing north. And it no longer has to do that because of its new strategic arrangements with Moscow. Number two, that frees China's strategic resources against its principal global adversary, which is the United States, particularly in East Asia and the West Pacific around the Taiwan scenario. And three, from a Chinese perspective, Russia is handy because it provides a rolling strategic distraction for the United States, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Libya, in North Africa, or now in Ukraine. The United States is a global power, and China at this stage is primarily an Asia-Pacific power. So for those reasons, people often ask the question, well, why don't the Chinese intervene to mediate? And the answer is because their geopolitical interests are very much aligned with Moscow. The only time you're likely to see China mediate is when Putin believes that he's achieved his strategic objectives in the Donbass and eastern Ukraine, and perhaps with a land corridor between the Donbass and Crimea. When, at maybe 1 minute to midnight, the Chinese then enter the frame as authorized mediators for a ceasefire, which was going to happen anyway. Mm-hmm. I think the second factor, however, about Ukraine is this. The Chinese know that in Europe in particular, their tacit support for Putin's position has generated a whole lot of negative reaction in Brussels and elsewhere. You'd know this from your own diplomatic experience in the UK and La Bella Italia. And so this is causing Europeans to say, well, why would China intervene in support of a Russian position on Ukraine when historically they have not done so? The Chinese view is, we'll take that, that's collateral damage. Our primary interest is with Russia, and we know the Europeans well, they'll forget about it all next year when trade resumes properly, as it continues actually with China as well. I think that's the second factor. But the third one about the military dimension, which you just mentioned, is this. If the Russian invasion of Ukraine was hard as a land-based operation, then what will a maritime operation, an amphibious operation, be like if and when you invade Taiwan, which would be the biggest amphibious operation since D-Day? A lot can go wrong. A lot can go wrong. And so this would cause Chinese military planners, I think, to have some conniptions about the political directive and a heavy breath on the back of their neck they're feeling from the Chinese political leadership to be ready for what I judge to be their optimal timetable of the late 20s and early 30s. So I think in that sense, I won't say it will alter the Chinese preferred timetabling for what they do over Taiwan, but it will cause the military establishment to reflect on the difficulty of executing a military plan like that.
Thanks, yeah. I mean, and also, apart from an amphibious invasion being more difficult, it's also pretty rugged territory in Taiwan as well. And just to follow on from that, you've studied in Taipei and as well as in mainland China. What, at this point, would Taiwan's expectation have of the United States, or indeed the United States and its allies, being prepared to fight a hot war to defend it, given the risks of perilous escalation or even catastrophic escalation?
That's a really good question as well, because, you know, when we look at Europe, and I think those of you in the audience who are engaged and interested in international affairs will conclude that the West collectively has kind of surprised itself by its level of coherence and by its level of common resolve in response to what's unfolded in Ukraine with the Russian invasion. It was wobbly in the first week when I think most in the West assumed what many in Washington assumed, which is that Putin's battle plan of being in Kiev within the first week would work, and it'll be all over Red Rover, Gonski. It didn't happen that way. And you've seen this growing European resolve, led by the Germans and by others, to say a line has been crossed and we will not simply allow Ukraine to be swallowed, even though we won't cross the tripwire of World War III by becoming direct combatants ourselves. And the provision of military equipment to the Ukrainians is perfectly permissible under the UN Charter. If a nation state is invaded by another nation state, the nation state which has been invaded can legitimately, under international law, request all manner of assistance from the rest of the international community. But here's the interesting twist. In Taiwan, I read a poll yesterday of Taiwanese public opinion on their view of the likelihood of American military assistance in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. That number has gone down from about 78% to 52% because the United States did not militarily intervene directly to support Ukraine. And the answer is, well, of course, Ukraine's not a NATO member, for which there is therefore not an automatic security guarantee, which happens under NATO membership. But nor does Taiwan, through the Taiwan Relations Act, count as an American ally. If you read carefully the Taiwan Relations Act, it's not like ANZUS, which is a mutual defence pact, not like the Japan Security Treaty, which is a mutual defence pact, or the one with the ROK, which is a mutual defence pact, or with the Philippines or Thailand, actually. It's different. And so it is the Chinese propaganda effort in the Chinese language media for the last 2 months has not been about humanitarian atrocities in Ukraine. It's been with a single message. Those Yanks didn't come in and fight for the Ukraine, and nor will they come to your defence either. Quite interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I mean, I guess we've seen, of course, the change in US foreign policy under the Trump period, and God forbid that he comes back in a couple of years' time. But, I mean, it was a tumultuous foreign policy that at times was hard to fathom, that built around protectionism. It was also, of course, his flirtation with the leader of North Korea and so on. So it was to most of us bizarre. So, but I guess the question I wanted to ask you, because of your closeness to both China and the US, is how does Beijing view Joe Biden?
You're right about the Trump administration. Trying to make coherent the incoherent was really problematic. And I used to be in Washington all the time, you know, as part of my think tank work. Trump foreign policy and national security policy was like a badly prepared tiramisu. It was just kind of all over the place, you know. You might like tiramisu, I'm not a big fan myself, but just looking at it, it's a bit of a mess, isn't it? You know. And so you had Trump's trade policy out the front, which was old-fashioned protectionism. It was like Blackjack McEwen was now in charge of the United States, those of you who have a memory for Australian politics. Then you had a national security policy, which this madman Trump thought that the best policy to dealing with the Korean Peninsula was to go and play handsies with Kim Jong-un and produce no results other than to legitimize Kim Jong-un in the eyes of the international community and take all the pressure off the Chinese as problem solvers on the Korean Peninsula. And then in human rights, Trump couldn't give a damn about anything. Uyghurs, Schmiggers, you know, Tibet, Schmibet, you know. He just couldn't have cared less. And so if you were sitting in Beijing trying to make sense of Trump, it was just kind of nutso. But then again, that's how we allies felt at the same time. I used to say this to the Chinese, how's your analysis going? I said, we can't make sense of it. I said, neither can we. And we're on his side. So on the Biden question, whatever the Chinese may say publicly about Biden, they are deeply respectful of this fact that the United States has now rebuilt all of its bridges to its allies in Asia and in Europe. The Trump administration was characterized by trade-based conflict with each of its allies, even Australia for a period. And secondly, demanding of its European allies and the Japanese and the Koreans financial compensation for the presence of American troops beyond previously agreed formulas. And so the tensions with the allies was huge, quite apart from the protectionist pressures, quite apart from the climate change dysfunctionality of the United States in dealing with the Europeans on global climate negotiations, which you're deeply familiar with. So Biden has actually mended the bridges. That is a huge advance. The United States has 46 treaty allies in the world, in Asia, Europe, and elsewhere. China has one, it's North Korea. If you're in Beijing, they think, is what they used to say to me when I was a diplomat there years ago, how did you end up with all the good allies? And we ended up with North Korea. How did that happen? Good question. So don't underestimate the fact when the Chinese look at the lay of the geopolitical map, they see this phenomenal network of American alliances, which are now back in functioning shape. The dysfunction of the United States remains its global economic footprint, because protectionism is still alive in the United States Congress. Look what happened to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, negotiated under Obama. My government had a reasonable amount to do with getting the Americans onto that page before we left office. And then the abandonment of their free trade negotiations with the Europeans through what was then called TTIP, you remember. And so the Americans are retreating into their own protectionist shell because of the dynamics of the Trumpian protectionist juggernaut, which has overtaken American politics, turbocharged by COVID, frankly. And so the weakness of America's global strategy is the Chinese economic juggernaut is still there. And in Xi Jinping's worldview, exercising, as I indicated before, a gravitational pull on the rest of the global economy in Europe and in Asia, causing ultimately countries to concede on foreign policy and security policy concerns with Beijing in order to preserve their economic access. Until the United States turns that one round, then their strategy will be incomplete.
October 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis was perhaps the worst example of when things went totally haywire. We came the closest to World War III. We also, I think the United States got up to DEFCON 2, which is the penultimate one before a nuclear war is about to start. What happened at the last minute was that various things were done, including a secret deal to withdraw missiles from Turkey. So there was some concessions made, and then there were various things put in place that were designed to avoid that ever happening again, albeit in a fraught situation of negotiations, so diffusing tensions. You talk about, I guess, which is similar, guardrails that would be put in place. Do those guardrails perhaps require a major incident or accident in the South China Sea to actually precipitate, because people suddenly see the folly of going further, or can they be done through an intermediary or something in the meantime?
Your Cuban Missile Crisis analogy is persuasive. It was a near-death experience for the world. Kennedy ultimately, in his decision to walk it back, in the diaries at the time, had been advised by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs that they were looking at 100 million American deaths. Population of the United States at that time was 200 million. So ICBM force in the Soviet Union then was significant. Not as significant as it is today. Not as significant as the Chinese force is today, for that matter. But what's important about what happened post-Cuba was that, as you indicated, they began to develop a series of de facto rules of the road. And whereas the Cold War from 1962 had another 30 years to run until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and there were multiple proxy wars throughout Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere, they did not really get to the stage again of coming close to blowing each other's brains out, because they generally thought it was a bad idea. They'd had their near-death experience and said, I didn't like that. The core of your question is it therefore politically and diplomatically possible to arrive at that conclusion between the Chinese and the Americans without having something similar occur? My judgment is it's in the balance. The reason I've written this book, which will go into Chinese language soon, is that it's not just targeted at the Americans, it's targeted at the Chinese as well. And I've tried to outline how this approach of managed strategic competition is doable from a Chinese strategic frame as well. Is that both strategic communities in Washington and Beijing, I believe, are in the marketplace for a framework to get both of them through the 2020s. And maybe this contributes to providing a framework which becomes doable and applicable. But it will require the two principals, that is, Xi Jinping and Biden, to agree on it. We will soon see in the United States, I presume, the release of the United States China strategy, at least its public version. That will be the conclusion of a long-term interagency process in the United States. There'll be a Chinese reaction to it. Perhaps that'll be the mechanism through which a form of joint strategic framework can be developed. I certainly hope so. As I said, I'm an old-fashioned pro-peace sort of guy. Give peace a chance, rather than just sit back and go into full amateur, hairy-chested mode a la Peter Dutton, and say, get ready for war next Thursday afternoon, because I want to grow more chest hair between now and then and look really macho on the way through, and hopefully win some votes by scaring the bejesus out of people on the way through.
Well, I'm pleased you mentioned Peter Dutton, because that was my next question. Theodore Roosevelt, President Roosevelt I, said that America must carry a big stick but speak softly. In dealing with China, both Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton have been doing the reverse. We don't have a big stick, and we've been speaking very loudly, including through a megaphone. And here in
suffering from small stickism.
And of course, in South Australia, with the submarine project, we've seen that a massive mess over that. We've now got rid of the French submarine, and that's costing billions. We're about to have them off the shelf, apparently, or maybe nuclear powered. And as you've just said, Dutton said on Anzac Day, Australians must now be prepared for war. Should we be getting nuclear submarines? And how hard is it going to be, given all of this rhetoric, to restore respect and civility to our relations with China? Because as I understand it, we used to play a bit of a go-between role between our national security ally, principal ally, and our chief economic ally, behind the scenes from the Hawke government onwards. Could we ever regain that position, given what's the water under the bridge?
The Chinese government under Xi Jinping has a clearly defined strategy along the lines I described before, and which I seek to outline in the book as well. In fact, the middle part of the book deals with what I describe as Xi Jinping's 10 concentric circles of interest. There's a lot of programmatic specificity in that. I thought you would have liked it. I don't think I'll ever live that down, will I? It was just a throwaway line of the speech.
It's there forever.
Yeah. It's anyway. So Xi Jinping's strategy, regionally and globally, so long as he's in power, is likely to continue to roll out. So whoever is the government in Canberra, whoever's the government in Washington, whoever's the government in Tokyo, whoever's the government in Delhi, is going to deal with this reality of an increasingly assertive China. So I don't seek to decry that reality or to undermine its significance. Any Australian government would have a challenge on their hands. So the question becomes one of, so what do you do about it? And this is where I radically part company with the approach that has been adopted rhetorically by Morrison and Dutton, because they think that the response, the policy response to a real-world foreign policy and national security problem is simply to take out a megaphone and scream at it. Now, my experience of life and politics and diplomacy is that that usually doesn't solve problems. Our approach has been historically one, make full national security preparedness for all future contingencies through a properly equipped and funded Australian Defence Force. It was our government that brought out the Defence White Paper of 2009, which took the decision on behalf of the Commonwealth to double the submarine fleet and to expand the submarine fleet by a third. Why? The Defence White Paper said so, because China's military expenditure was radically increasing at the time. The Chinese did not like what we said. In fact, they told us through diplomatic channels not to do it, at which point I then released it, because you never allow yourself to be told by another country what to do. And that was the considered conclusion of our entire national security establishment. The second thing that we did, however, with our Chinese counterparts was to nonetheless, having made our operational preparedness for future national security policy contingencies clear, at an operational level, we still pursued a balanced relationship with Beijing. What does that mean in practice? It meant the following. It meant that in all of our engagement with the Chinese government, we were very clear about one thing. We believe in universal human rights, and if that upsets our friends in China from time to time because of what's happening to Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or what's happening to Tibetans in Tibet, or to dissidents in China, we will apply the standards laid out in the Universal Human Rights Declaration of 1948, to which China is also signatory under international law. Number two, that we will continue to reflect our common interests as an American ally, because we've been allies of the United States for 100 years. That does not mean we have to comply with every element of US foreign policy. Remember, we objected to US policy in Iraq and in Vietnam. Thirdly, with our Chinese counterparts, we should maximize our economic engagement in trade and investment and capital markets, etc. Four, we should maximize our collaboration with China in the institutions of global governance, the G20. We worked like this with China in responding to the global financial crisis. The engagements we had with China at the time were fascinating. We did a domestic stimulus strategy here, you'll remember. It helped avoid recession in this country. We're the only major economy in the world not to go through recession at the time because of the fiscal stimulus strategy we adopted. However, simultaneously, we're having negotiations and discussions with other governments about their domestic stimulus strategies. Because if you did one in Australia and stimulus was not occurring elsewhere in the world, then frankly, it would not have worked. The Chinese adopted a massive stimulus strategy as well. So working with the Chinese through the institutions of global governance on climate and on finance and elsewhere is all part of a balanced relationship with Beijing. The fifth principle of an Australia-China relationship, an Australia-China strategy, in my argument, is this. If you're going to depart company with Beijing, do it in either of two ways. One, where you really are going to radically disagree. And I'm the guy who blocked the Chinese takeover of Rio. I physically blocked it through the FIRB process. The Chinese were not happy, but I did it for national interest purposes. We could not afford one of Australia's two major resource companies to be owned by the country which bought most of the resource. It would permanently compromise global minerals energy prices and therefore Australia's underlying national interests. But did we go out there and do a Dutton and take out the megaphone? No. We stuck it at the end of some obscure press release on a Thursday afternoon because the Chinese knew what we had done, but we weren't about to turn it into a capital case for the day's media, for the delectation of the Australian and the Murdoch media every day of the week, because it was seen to be good, hairy-chested domestic politics. So that's one way of handling it, which is simply be mindful of how you execute a decision. The key thing is the operational decision, not the politics and the rhetoric of shoving it in someone's face. But if you must part company with China publicly, directly, on a fundamental issue of national importance, for example, like the origins of COVID in Wuhan. Now, that is a fact. That's where the virus came from. I'm the co-signatory of a letter with 200 or so global political worthies in the New York Times 2 weeks before Morrison made his statement about the need for an independent global investigation into the origins of COVID. We're all out there demanding the same thing. However, we didn't represent governments. I was no longer a serving head of government. But what Morrison then did was unilaterally, without doing diplomacy with all the other countries, he issued an Australian government position on its own, demanding that China be subjected to an independent global inquiry. What he should have done is spent another week on the Alexander Graham Bell, getting the Europeans and the rest of Asia on board. Joint position of 35 or 50 countries. Guess what? China can't single you out for a cruel and unusual punishment at that point, which is what they have done. So if you're going to part company with Beijing, be smart about it. Do it in company with others, rather than go into the Dutton school of global diplomacy, which is, let me grow some more chest hair over this thing. Did you see Emmanuel Macron's chest hair, by the way?
I did.
By God, where did that come from? Jeez.
Now, I'm sure I'm about to get a wind-up, but I've got a couple more questions.
I'm sorry my voice is so rotten.
And one of them is about the Quad, which is the security dialogue involving the US, Japan, Australia and India. China has condemned it as being an attempt at an Asian NATO. The Quad had a pretty rocky stop-start. Are you optimistic that the Quad can be more effective and energised in a positive way? And do you think that others, including Korea, would be likely to join?
Yeah, whether the Quad will become a Quint,
Yeah.
which is in the obscure international relations literature now, but everyone's about to learn a new word. It's called the Quint. Look, the Quad Mark I, back when we were in office, had already been killed by Howard and by George Bush and by the then Japanese Prime Minister Fukuda, who replaced Abe Mark I, and by Manmohan Singh, the then Prime Minister of India. In fact, in several months before I was ever elected, even though the Murdoch talking point ever since has been that I killed the Quad, the public record demonstrates that was not the case. Quad Mark II arose about 2 or 3 years ago Again, Abe-san brought it to the fore, and it was consummated by Biden at summit level. And the reason why it came about was because the Chinese radically overreached with India. The Sino-Indian border clash of April, May, June of 2020 finally caused India to say, enough is enough. And then it was elevated automatically to a summit level gathering with a full spectrum agenda, from foreign policy through to security policy collaboration. But bear in mind this, it is not a mutual defence pact. It is a foreign policy coordination and security policy coordination arrangement. It may be a stepping stone to something different. Let's see. The message to Beijing is clear, and why on balance I support it is because if you push too hard, which China had done with India and had done in different respects with the Japanese in the East China Sea, and have done in Southeast Asia with the Philippines and Vietnam, you generate a geostrategic reaction. And whereas our friends in Southeast Asia will publicly say, we don't like great power competition within the region, privately they're very relieved about the Quad because it provides ballast, it provides a counterweight, and in fact provides the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, all 10 of them, with more freedom for manoeuvre because there is now a harder perimeter around them. On the South Korean question, I conclude on this. And again, it is about action and reaction and China's overreach. Because of the most recent South Korean elections, the centre-right party fought a campaign which said that the Republic of Korea will now take a more robust position in response to our neighbour China, and we will join the Quad. And based on that, they had a 52-48 win, a surprising win in the South Korean elections. And so, assuming the incoming president of the ROK, President Yoon, honours that pre-election commitment, then we are likely to see the evolution of the Quad into a Quint. What its future mandate of operations will be, I think, is a work in progress, but it is part of what you see in the history of international relations, which is one power becomes, in the view of the rest of the world, too big, then you have a balancing act then engendered on the part of other countries seeking to offset the influence of that emerging great power. The burden of the book is, let's try and do it as peacefully as possible.
Thank you. Finally, and final question is this. You were a candidate for the United Nations Secretary Generalship.
Didn't turn out well.
And it didn't turn out well. One of the reasons was that the Turnbull government withdrew its support, and in order to succeed, a candidate has to have the support of their own government. And for me, because of my New Zealand background, I remember how the National Party in New Zealand strongly supported Helen Clark for a position at the UN, and also supported Mike Moore to head up the UN, the International Trade Organization. So, maybe we just need to be a bigger country on these sorts of on bipartisanship. But on these issues, China, the US, and on the Ukraine and Russia, despite the recent visit in the last few days, the UN seems increasingly irrelevant. In terms of the thesis of your book, could the UN, could its Secretary General play a significant role in trying to take these steps?
At present, we don't have an effective interlocutor between China and the United States. That's the problem of the international relations system as of today. And you're right about the criticism of Secretary General Guterres at present, because there's an open letter from 250 senior UN staff as of last week, critical of the fact that here we are 3 months into the Ukraine war, and he had not gone to Kiev. And then when he went to Moscow first. So that's a separate debate within New York. Whether bringing about a concept of managed strategic competition could be advanced through the productive engagement of the UN, I don't know. Historically, the great powers do not like meddlesome secretaries general. But my argument, when you look back to the days of Kofi Annan was quite a remarkable Secretary General. When the Iraq War was about to unfold, for those of you with a memory for that period, 2003, nearly 20 years ago, Kofi Annan fell out of the good graces of the United States because he opposed the war. Because he said the conditions for that war did not exist, that the UN weapons inspectors had not found any evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that therefore the invasion of Iraq would be invalid under international law. Kofi Annan was right. And the United States then, under the Bush administration, hounded him from that day on. It was appalling, but he was absolutely right in what he sought to do on behalf of the international community. Could those similar circumstances arise in the future? I'm uncertain as to whether that would now be the case. The burden of my book, Mike, is that reasonable people in Washington and Beijing who are not uber nationalists and who are rational, I think are looking for a way through this at the moment. And the reason why some of us are putting pen to paper at the moment is to find a formula which might be adapted or applied to at least see us through this decade. A decade which I do call the decade of living dangerously, and not just for poetic license, but there's just too much going wrong at the moment.
Ladies and gentlemen, on your behalf, I'd like to thank Kevin and for a terrific exposition of his book.
Thanks.
Great, terrific.